I've talked before about the idea of there being an A plot and a B plot in Star Trek, in television in general, but especially in Star Trek. It's a formula they've used rather frequently. It's semi-rare there's just an A plot. And occasionally you'll have a C plot, and on a rare occasion you'll actually have a D plot too. I've also talked about why the A plot B plot formula can work and can be a strength, and why it can fail in both of these tasks and end up not being good or a strength. I don't remember if I name checked the Swarm specifically, but the Swarm is definitely an episode that I feel that the A plot and the B plot formula is probably one of the worst examples I've ever seen of it. Where the A plot, which is the plot about the Doctor and his plight, is interesting, engaging, character dynamic, and, oh my god, actual continuity both behind and forward. This is pretty much a critical juncture in the Doctor's story, for all intents and purposes, across the series. And it's one of the true rare exceptions in this, new era of Trek that I've mentioned previously, where continuity with regards to character growth will be both maintained and actually be focused on. And then there's the B plot. I've tried to summarize the B plot in as neutral a manner as possible without trying to sound derogatory. I failed a couple times in my practice, while I was getting groceries today. But we're going to go and do the best I can here, okay? The B plot is they've encountered a mysterious alien race that controls a vast swath of territory that they do not want to or cannot find a way to defeat without having to resort to technobabble. And so as a result, they have tried to hide from these people, but then they fail and then they defeat them with technobabble at the end. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. The A-plot and the B-plot formula exists for a good reason. Really, it does. The idea here is, when you're working on a show, there's so many stories you want to tell. And usually, a lot of these stories are actually purchased from independent writers, people who may not have even written the story specifically for individual characters or whatnot. They just pitch a story idea. And then the people at Star Trek, people at Paramount actually buy that idea and basically put it in the shelf, and they just keep those in mind when they're putting together new episodes. Sometimes those get modified a great deal. Sometimes they get blended into other episodes. This is pretty common. This is how this generally works. Only a few episodes are actually specifically written from the word go by the actual writers of the show. That does happen, of course. But the reason I bring this up is that one of the benefits of the A-B formula, or the A, B, C, and D formula, if we want to get down to it, is the idea that you can put more stories out there on the screen. You have so much runtime, and you have so much you can do with it, and sometimes a plot just isn't really engaging enough to actually flesh out an entire episode about. It would be padded, or it would be completely rewritten to the point where you get where I'm going with this. There's not much you can do with it without just taking the story idea back to the whiteboard. So they go ahead and affix another plot on top of there. Now, a lot of times this can work. TNG and DS9 both on several occasions, and yes, Voyager 2, and even Enterprise in its later seasons, has made this idea work, and the most common way to make it work is either thematically, in terms of character interaction, or literally make the two plots important to each other, integral to each other. That thematic one is a really important one. There's an episode in DS9, I'm trying to think of the name. It's a really weird name. It's like Faith, the Great River, and something else. It's an episode about, pretty much, it's about Nog over here, and then it's about Odo over here. And yet these two stories actually have a fairly large amount to do with each other, thematically speaking, even though they literally have nothing to do with each other, and even character-wise, they are completely segregated. So that actually worked pretty well. Sometimes the A-B plots are intricately tied in as far as what's actually happening dynamically. There's a lot of examples of that, but actually my personal favorite example of that is The Best of Both Worlds, Part 1, where the A-plot, well, okay, it's debatable which one's the A-plot in that case, but you've got one plot which is about Riker, his character growth, his development as a character, and the other plot is Well, I shouldn't have to tell you this. It's the frickin' Borg. But those two plots, those two stories were intricately and directly tied into each other, and it really helped flesh out that episode. It's one of the reasons it's one of the greats. In all honesty, Scorpion is another good example of that. There were two plots in Scorpion. Actually, there were arguably three, but we'll get to that later. All of them were directly tied into it. And you get the idea. I don't want to keep giving examples. The point is that's the most common way to really tie in the A-B plot formula. But every now and again, you can have a situation where an A plot and a B plot have nothing to do with each other, and it actually works. I'm not going to give you examples here. I already have spent too much time. Also, I forgot to write down the name of the episodes. But the point, TNG did this several times. DS9 did this several times. Point is, Voyager has done this a couple times. The point is, it is still possible to make that work. The way you make that work is really simple. You acknowledge that the budget should go into one episode, as far as post-production. I really got to stress this differently. The post-production budget really should go into one of those plots, and the other plot should be a bottle show. For those of you who do not know, just really quick, a bottle show is effectively an episode designed to be cheaper, from a purely budgetary and post-production perspective. Very few graphical effects, very few guest stars, very little in terms of what they're going to do with that. It primarily exists as a vehicle. Character-driven is a great way to do this. Making it confined to a specific area is a great way to do this. There's lots of tricks you can do, and bottle shows are not necessarily bad things, or indeed good things. In fact, a lot of my favorite episodes of Star Trek in general are bottle shows. Duet in DS9 is a great example of that, for example. But what we have here is a phenomenal A-plot, and if I was to be as kind as possible, a disinteresting B-plot with regards to the ship and the swarm, and that gives the title its name. And I really was hunkering down, trying to kind of figure out why that is, and I think I've got a good reason after I actually watched this episode twice, believe it or not, because I really wanted to give a satisfactory answer to this question. Why did this episode's A-B plot thing fail? I could just say it fails. I could just say that the swarm plot was dumb. That's not enough. That's not good enough. Here's the best answer I could give to you. The A-plot in this case, it's pretty obvious why the A-plot succeeded. First of all, it's Robert Picardo. He is a great actor. He knows what he's doing. I'll be talking about that later. It's a character most people cared about, myself included, both originally and on repeat viewings. The Doctor is one of the most beloved characters on the show. There's some really interesting dynamics between him and B'Elanna and him and Kes. And, the Zimmerman thing was really well fleshed out. Point is, very character-focused, a lot of good talent on display. And this is the thing that really kicked me into my mind as I was watching it the second time. At no point in time did the tension or the drama ever feel fake or forced. There was some genuine, I actually found myself holding my breath. I've seen this episode. I know what happens. I actually found myself, nevertheless, unconsciously holding my breath just because of how invested I felt in the situation, because at no point was I like, it's going to be fine. Now I say that, this is kind of one of those weird situations. As I've said before, I can reread a book 100 times and never get bored of it. My point is, even if this was the first time viewing it, at no point did I feel like the drama or tension was faked. Okay? That brings us to the B plot. Every single point at which they tried to build up this swarm as a threat was almost immediately shot down, in some cases literally within seconds of the point being brought up. I made a couple of notes, but just watch the episode. You'll see what I mean here. Okay, so we've crossed into this field, and oh my god, we can't detect him, and all this stuff happens, but it's okay because we figured out a way to detect it by reconfiguring our sensors. They have a huge, vast period of space that we can't bypass, but there's one area we can get bypassed within a couple of weeks or days or whatever, so that's a good thing. We can't understand what their language is, but let's go ahead and just reconfigure the universal translator so it works, which, by the way, is so stupid, I just don't really feel like commenting on that anymore. Oh my god, they're taking away all our energy, but it's okay because we should just feed this back to them. Every single point at which the swarm could have been interesting or engaging or mysterious or actually feel threatening was literally almost immediately shot right back down by the crew and by the script. It's like, no, we can take care of that. No, we can take care of that. The other problem with the swarm is the obvious one. They've never been mentioned before, and they'll never be mentioned again. It's hard to build up a force as ominous or intimidating or dreadful, the kind of thing that takes time or some kind of establishment to do in a single episode even if it was just the one episode. But the fact that it's actually a B plot, one of the plots in an episode, yeah, that just... Now, let's go ahead and go down my list here, because I got a few other things I want to talk about with this episode. First of all, this is the beginning of the Tom and Taurus relationship, for anybody who's actually curious. This was literally the beginning of it from the writing, creative staff, productive standpoint. I mentioned that there were exceptions to the no continuity for characters rule, and there's actually two of them in this episode. One's the Doctor, I'll talk about that more later, and one is this one. This was done deliberately, too. Originally, the original intent on when the script was first written down was just to have Paris flirt with B'Elanna because it seemed like something that Paris would do. Very simple, very disinteresting, all things considered. Pardon me. I forget to silence my phone for these things. Now, the thing is, Roxanne Dawson and Robert McNeil both had surprisingly good chemistry on the scene. And they actually took it and redid it just a little bit, rejiggered just a little, and actually did a second take, which is very rare for Star Trek, by the way. They usually don't do rehearsals or multiple takes for these episodes. Fun fact. Actually did a second take where they acted a little bit more warmly to each other and just kind of changed the tone of it. The words on the page didn't really change much, but it deliberately became the first, flirtatious moment between the two, and that led to something that was, in my opinion, a very good decision. I've said it before and I've said it again. Star Trek, in my opinion, generally does not do relationships particularly well. There's two real exceptions to that come to mind immediately. One is, of course, O'Brien and Keiko. For reasons that I will not discuss here because it deserves... They're not even on this show. But the other one is Tom and B'Elanna. And I think one of the biggest reasons, other than the obvious natural chemistry the actors had together, is the fact that they built it slow. I don't even remember the actual episode when they finally get together. It's quite a ways from... In fact, I'm almost positive it's actually in Season 4. I could be wrong about that. But that's exactly my point. They did... Too often, Star Trek and television in general, and fiction in general, will do a thing where it's like... These people meet, and then they have a relationship. It just kind of blows off, or they have some kind of thing going on. I mean, how many often does that happen in a movie where protagonist A, who is male, will meet protagonist B, who is female, or, I guess the genders don't matter, but you get the point. Romance option A and romance option B meet, and then they're together by the end of the movie. Sometimes it can work, don't mistake me, but my point is, too often I feel they just kind of fling people together because they need to have a romance within their particular movie, book, show, etc., whatever. So rare is it that you'll actually see them build it, actually have it build as a friendship, have mutual respect kind of be a thing, and have that slow boil thing where it reaches the point where we actually feel like we're genuinely invested in the relationship by the time it actually becomes one, rather than just kind of these two are together now. It's kind of funny because that exact theme was attempted with another relationship over in Deep Space Nine, and it mostly failed due to the fact that the two actors involved genuinely did not think they should be in a relationship, despite they had chemistry with each other, don't mistake me. But they both really disliked the idea of it. And so they were both... You can tell their performances when they're in the romance scenes are just a little more wooden and stilted than they otherwise would be, because neither of them actually felt like this is where their characters should go, and they were just shot down by the producers. I am, of course, talking about Odo and Kira. Both of them were just like, nope, don't want to have anything to do with this. So it's another thing. The slow boil is not obviously a path to success, but I think it worked well in here. I just wanted to mention that. Now, let's talk about the obvious problems with having one point of failure. O'Brien himself said it best. I'm going to be paraphrasing this. I wouldn't feel safe if I didn't have a triple backup, or a secondary backup, I believe is actually how I said it. I wouldn't feel safe if I didn't have a secondary backup. That's how life actually works in real life, and has for years. We have backups for everything, technologically speaking, engineering speaking, societally speaking. We have backups, and usually we have backups for those backups. Sometimes we have another layer of backups behind that. That's how it works. I mean, get on the bridge of an actual naval ship and tell me how many backups upon backups are on that thing. Because I've actually heard a Navyman talk about all those backups. And while it was a little bit tedious to hear about it all, it was still fascinating to hear just how much thought and effort put into, okay, well, what if this fails? Well, what if this fails? What if these three specific things fail? Well, what if these things fail and then the thing to save those things fail? That kind of a thing. My reason for pointing this out is Voyager has always played it a little more loosey-goosey. Um, the Doctor is the only doctor on the ship, and Kess is the only nurse. Now, I know what you're going to bring up, Tom Paris, but I'm just going to look at you like this, raise my eyebrow, and then we're going to move on. Point is, this is something that I feel they should have actually addressed a lot earlier than this. Because they have, for all intents and purposes, one point of failure in the Doctor. In fact, think about this. One of the first signs of the Doctor, was pretty much the second sign, or third, sign of his losing his memories is he can't remember how to do the procedure, the life-saving procedure on Tom Paris. They might have lost Tom if he had just been there by himself and didn't have Kess. If Kess didn't happen to be very intelligent, very applied, and have a nearly eidetic memory, or actually eidetic memory, I forget which, but either way, if she hadn't been who she was and been positioned to be the excellent nurse that she was, there's a pretty good chance Tom Paris would have just died. Which, I'd also like to point out, he's your best pilot. Not your only pilot, but definitely your best pilot. So that's another point of failure you just lost because the first point of failure you just lost. Now that being said, a lot of people who watch this show saw this coming a while in advance, myself included. We were actually waiting for this episode to happen. The reason being, a lot of us had theories about how the Doctor functioned. I've already kind of given my basic thought process. He wasn't originally sentient by my definition and estimation, my guesswork, my opinion. But because he was so advanced, because of all the experiences he had, because of how much time he had, not only to have experiences, but then to process them, he grew to the point where he became, for all intents and purposes, sentient, a living sentient being. Follow? My reason for pointing that out is he was never designed to be sentient, and there's obvious problems with that are going to have to be dealt with. To use a contrast here to explain what I mean, Data was designed to be sentient from word go. That was actually the whole point of the positronic brain that Soon was working on. The Doctor, the EMH programs, were not, and therefore it's kind of funny that this goes back into the plan I was just talking about. Backups, double backups, triple backups. They may have existed, but they were never designed to deal with this level of problem, this particular scale of difficulty. And so it is basically an inevitable conclusion that at some point the Doctor would start to break down. Now, granted, I'm a network engineer who's been working in computers since he was a kid, so I have a pretty good understanding of how this sort of thing works. And this is actually kind of how it would work. I can explain this really simple if anybody doesn't catch this. It's not about filling up with space and then you run out of hard drive space. That's not actually the problem. They don't explain this well in the episode. But you get this impression, especially given the rest of the show. That's not the issue. They've got tons of storage space. The problem is the more stuff you put on a hard drive, the longer it takes for it to process things, the longer it takes your computer to find information it needs, to run programs necessary to actually have the CPU process, for the RAM to actually be dumped and reloaded, all that stuff. In other words, the more stuff you have on a hard drive, the slower your computer runs, pretty much universally. There are, of course, methods to bypass that, but most of those methods exist because they were designed that way from the get-go. And hence you see the problem. Imagine a computer like mine, which suddenly has to deal with functioning as a local server, storage server, which is in 24-hour usage, by the way. Now, imagine that at that point, it is now having to deal with network traffic from, pretty much the entirety of the Midwest, and constantly storing all the information and data as a result of that. Now, I have the hard drive. Well, okay, for the purpose of this exercise, assume I have the hard drive space. That's not the problem. The problem is eventually that computer is just going to start chugging and chugging, and it will actually reach a point where it becomes unusable, just like the Doctor did. It was a surprisingly intelligent portrayal of exactly how I think that would work, where the Doctor is still functioning, because the computer's still running, but he was having so much trouble accessing files and accessing programs within his program that the overall thing would just be functioning as effectively a doll with almost nothing there. His memories were faulty, or only bits and pieces of them were being pulled at a time because of how much time it was taking to process them. That kind of a thing, right? Now here's the thing. This is both a strength and a weakness about this plot point. The weakness is essentially, it just boggles my mind that nobody actually really tried to do anything about this in advance, because this, as I just said, is a fairly mundane computer problem that exists now. And they talk about how Taurus installed, more buffer space, but literally, that is effectively just slotting a few more hard drives in. That doesn't actually do anything to fix it. Or maybe, I guess, in equivalency, that'd be more like adding more RAM, which would help, but would not solve the problem. So I just found the whole thing funny that they haven't done anything to prepare for this. And it just kind of made me go, really? The reason it's a strength, I've already covered the big reason it's a strength, but I really want to stress this because you go into a situation like this, you have to have some kind of long-term solution, especially if you're going to be bringing it up. It would have been too easy for them to just brush under the table that the doctor is having this problem. Have it never be an issue, basically. Have the doctor just grow into sentience and it's no problem. And let's be honest, most of us would probably go ahead and accept that. Instead, what they did was they called attention to it. The doctor is having this issue, and he will never be the same again. Now, that never same again is debatable, since, for all intents and purposes, it's only actually mentioned once from this point on. But there was an intention behind the scenes for solving this long term. Based on the interviews I've seen and based on the articles I've read, I don't know for a certainty if that intention, if that plan was designed before or after this episode, but based on the production order and how they were working on things, I actually think they had this plan in mind prior to this episode. So they bring up this plot point, they bring up that the doctor is now fixed, but only partially fixed. Some of his memory is restored, some of his personality is restored, and this is now still a problem. This is something that will only be a band-aid for a solution. And then the real solution comes along later. And yes, in case it's not obvious, the real solution I am mentioning is the one that happens in Future's End. I got to give absolute props to Future's End for that, but we'll get to that when we get to that episode. I do like one other thing. The doctor, when confronted with the choice, this is going back to the computer analogy. This is absolutely true. How do you fix that problem? Well, you just wipe everything. Wipe it down to the deep, clean slate, and that will fix the problem. The obvious problems with this are both brought up. Number one, it's a Band-Aid, because eventually it'll just fill up again. And number two, all that stuff that went away is the doctor's personality, sentience, experiences, etc. That will all go away. That will go away permanently, without restoration possibility. So yeah, that is obviously a solution that most people, myself included, did not want to see happen. And yet, the thing I love is the doctor himself, while still in full control of his faculties, by the way, he was only having very minor memory problems when he made this decision, says absolutely and without question, twice actually, no, just wipe me. And I like that because that is very indicative of the doctor's personality. While he has grown a personality, while he does have an ego, while he does have a sense of self and individuality, while he does praise and value those things, in his opinion, it is simply unacceptable to put his needs before the crew's. He is a doctor. And so it is automatically his choice to go ahead and wipe it. I loved that. I also love that both Kes and B'Elanna were interested in trying to save him. And B'Elanna's interactions through him with this episode were actually really good. Dawson herself commented on this. She liked the fact that it was a nice step in her own character growth by showing how she was willing to look at the doctor as a person and actually care about his well-being rather than just viewing him as a program, which is basically how she started this show. So I like that too. I also have to give tons of praise for the double duty that Picardo pulled in this. They had some really good composite shots. It is harder than it sounds to play two completely separate roles, especially within the same work, the same episode. Brent Spiner, when he did Brothers, well, let's just say that was a nightmare for him to do, playing three characters in the same episode, acting against only himself. Yeah, that was a very rare exception, and they did a lot of rehearsals and a lot of work on that episode, which, again, is pretty rare for Star Trek, especially back then. But in this case, a talented actor can pull that off, is basically what I'm saying. Brent Spiner did it, and of course Robert Picardo does it brilliantly here. His portrayal of Zimmerman is surprisingly human, all things considered. He's certainly, at first you just see him as this brash, arrogant, egotistical, impatient man, but he does have a degree, he manages to throw some humanity in there, some layers of subtlety, some layers of interest or caring or whatever, he really does portray a man who is just doing his job, but at the same time does actually care about doing a good job and does want to do a good job. And I think it's really best summarized when he says, it has been a brief but apparently a noble existence. And then he goes ahead and allows himself to cease to be. Now, I'm not arguing that Zimmerman, that artificial Zimmerman, was sentient, because by my own definitions, he wasn't. He wasn't active or experienced enough to be so. But as was mentioned, his matrix is just as complicated as the Doctor's. So, on some level or another, he did understand he was destroying himself to recreate the Doctor, and felt like that was the correct choice. And there's a degree of simple humanity in the way he portrays that. His words, his tone, his expressions. And that's just, I wanted to praise that. I only have 2 more notes here, kind of a brief episode to talk about. First of all, this is the first time that our good friends from Babylon 5 actually started doing the CGI effects on Voyager and Enterprise, pretty much full time. It's kind of sad, because I have both praise and kind of an eye roll for them. The shots of the actual swarm, and when we see it as the swarm, are actually pretty good, and do a pretty good job of getting across the fact that this is tons and tons of ships. Doesn't explain how one chunk of ships can protect a period of a chunk of space so vast it would take months to cross, but, whatever, we'll ignore that. The eye roll moment is actually when the ships all explode on the ship. Now, okay, this is just silly. I'm not even going to comment. I'm not even going to comment on the fact that these ships actually explode on the hull of Voyager. Dozens of them. Try to think about what that would do to the ship for a moment, but let's ignore that. No, the thing I want to comment on is how silly it looked. And I could just tell that the people were doing their best to try and make it look as decent as possible, but there's no escaping that. That is going to look silly basically no matter how you present it. Some things just look cartoony when you put them on the screen, no matter how many effects you put on it. And I don't want to really make fun of it, but at the same time, I just wonder, why did they think that was a good idea? And then I remember, oh yeah, these people had watched the Tholian Web, and that's where the idea came from. So never mind. My final note. Actually, there was one other note, but I have decided not to comment on it because you guys made your wishes clear with regards to the Imperium here. But I do have my final note. I mentioned the concept of sentience with regards to the EMH, and holographic rights. Some of you may know this. Several of the books tried to examine holographic rights after Voyager ended. Some of them did that really badly. I'm not going to name names. If you've read them, you know what I'm talking about. Some of them did it relatively well. The problem was, though, that no matter how you look at this situation, the EMHs have the potential to be sentient. And that mere fact right there creates a huge, huge moral quandary when dealing with these kind of things. And do make this clear. I'm not pulling a technically, because you could pull it technically and say that anything has the potential for sentience with the right external stimuli, and that is correct. But it is also a technically, so it is actually wrong. The point I'm here is that the EMH needs only one, well, technically 2 things to become sentient. Time and experiences, and that's it. It is such an advanced, sophisticated program with so much algorithm, with so much processing power, with so much adaptability built into it, that all it needs is to run for a decent period of time, and it will be qualified as sentience. The question that was brought up for me in this episode is, we know this is not the only EMH. I mean, First Contact comes out in a bit, and we see an EMH on the Enterprise E. So we know those things are pretty much standard back home by about this point in time. How many of those had the chance to become sentient? How many of those did anyone actually consider the fact that they might become sentient? How many of those were treated like they were just property? How many of those had their rights taken away from them and were then forced to work in dilithium mines? How many of them in the dilithium mines, thanks to experiences in time, then became sentient? You see where I'm going with this? My point in bringing this up is this is actually a very sticky, very dark, and very moral issue to be discussed, because there is no good answer here. Not really. Not when you get down to it. I'm reminded of Moriarty back in TNG, who demanded that Picard free him from his prison, and Picard wanted to. I mean, really, wanted to give Moriarty what he wanted, but couldn't. Moriarty's creator, quote unquote, lacked the ability to give him the freedom and life he desired. And I find myself wondering how many of those people back home, back in the Alpha and Beta quadrants, became friends with their EMHs, grew to like them, grew to actually care about them. How many of them grew to hate them? How many of them grew to dislike them because of their notorious bedside manner? How many of them couldn't wait for the EMH Mark II, or the Mark III, or the Mark IV? At what point, when we kept advancing these already capable of becoming sentient being programs, did we get to the point where they basically are sentient out of the box? At what point are we actually creating sentience here? You see where I'm going with this? I'm not actually trying to answer any of the questions I'm bringing up either, because that's not really the point. The very point I'm trying to make is this very topic is a huge topic. It's something that Star Trek fans have been debating ever since Voyager came out, and still debate to this day. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on this entire matter. I've heard many different opinions, and I'm always interested in hearing more. Either way, I'll see you in the next video.